This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
No one's got a sign around their neck saying, please talk to me about bog ecology.
Ben Petrosaur, who has been at Wizards for 12 years. Patrick Rennie, who has been at Wizards and Paizo for 6 years. I can't imagine them looking for someone to step in and lead these people.
Werewolf the Referening.
Well, the UK isn't really part of Europe now, is it?
Is it possible to make an unintelligent rampaging monster into a long-term villain? Have you been in the United States for the last few years?
CR is terrible. CR is perfect. They fixed CR in Monster Manual 2024. I've seen that YouTube thumbnail 8 times already.
All that and more right now. She goes, 3, 2, 1, it's time to get up, Ben. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. And then I say, Tori, why are you waking me up like this? And she says, Ben, it's Tuesday. It's time for an Eldritch Lorecast. Or it's Monday if you're in the US, or it's Wednesday or Tuesday if you're listening to this on YouTube. My name's Ben Byrne, and if you're still watching, I am joined, as always, by Shawn Merwin, James Hake, Dael Kingsmill. And Dael, I have a question for you from Sasha, who is asking, what is a great Session 0 question to get new players into character building?
It's about how I frame questions. So instead of asking someone, how do your characters know each other? Even though that's a perfectly good question, perfectly good leading question, I tend to frame it as, do you think your two characters know each other? How might you know each other? Because there's something about framing it as a ponderance. Like, hey, what do you think about your character? Do you think that they went to school together? Do you think that they fought together in a war? Framing it in this kind of open-ended, what do you think about your character way, I think tends to make people realize what they already kind of instinctively know about their character deep down that they're not necessarily verbalizing.
Got you. Instead of feeling like they've got to invent something to fit the question.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I don't know what to say. I think I really like Dale's answer. I really love the idea of like getting them in a thoughtful headspace rather than a test-taking headspace, right? It's like once you need to decide on something, you lock up. You know, you could ask me my favorite movie right now, and I'd be like, I've never watched a movie in my life, actually.
Yeah, same.
But if you start getting me thinking about it, then I can start throwing out wrong answer after wrong answer and kind of sketch my way to something that I'm happy with.
2 answers. One's the snarky answer, which is, how much time are you willing to spend building a character before you actually get to play the game? Because as we've talked about many, many times, building a character for new players might not be the way to go, but giving them a character and letting them play the game might be a better answer. Dale's answer is absolutely spot on. I would maybe ask one question before that, which is, you're going to be playing a character. What kind of story do you want that character to be in? Do you want it to be a romance? Do you want it to be a war story? Do you want it to be a horror story? Just to get them in that frame of mind of they are going to be playing a character in a story. And if they're super interested in one particular genre or one particular type of story, then as the game master, I can make sure I at least get that genre in at the start of the game. So if they want to be in a mystery, by God, the first thing they do is going to be finding a dead body and they need to figure out who done it. Right. And then the character creation part can come later. It also depends on the game that we're playing. If you're playing a fate game, while you're building the character, you're answering all of these questions as part of character creation. That's different than running D&D or Daggerheart or some other game from the D&D sort of genre tree where it's a little bit trickier.
I have a ponderance, and I'm curious to know if y'all will agree with this ponderance, because in the chat we're getting suggestions like asking them kind of, small questions to get them thinking about their character. Who was your father and what do they do, says Chef Chris, and Michael in chat suggesting apparently a Colbert question about what is the best sandwich? What's your character's favorite sandwich? Is it better to be asking questions relevant to the adventure that you're about to go on, rather than necessarily like, what's your favorite sandwich? What do you sleep on? Those sort of things. Because I think those are good questions for like deep character building, but especially for new players. And as you were kind of leading on, Shawn, like trying to get them to think about the adventure. If you ask them what their favorite sandwich is, and then you're playing a dark fantasy campaign, and then it turns into, we want to find our favorite sandwiches because that's what the players are thinking about when they created their characters. suddenly the tone and the of the adventure and the character motivation doesn't quite match up. So trying to match the questions to whatever the adventure you're going to be doing is that, do you agree?
I totally agree. I think the question itself leads us to character creation being the ultimate thing, when it's not necessary. Depending on the game again, it might not be, and it may be something that you want to handle later.
I mean, as a player who did once derail an entire session where we all just really got fixated on baking a cake instead of dealing with what was going on in the cemetery, players don't need help finding things to get distracted by. But at the same time, I think there is some use in questions like that as icebreakers for new players, where you're like, look, it's not that important. What's your favorite sandwich? What does your dad do?
We, as experienced players, totally forget what the experience for a new player is. And by new player, I mean brand new. What is a die? What is a role-playing game? We totally forget that experience, and we do what we love. We do what we want, but we don't often enough stop and think, what do these new players need? And that's the question that we have to, as game designers, as new DMs, as teachers of the game, have that empathy and have that understanding of what these folks are going through.
What do they need is such a good way to frame this. Because I just had a session 0 for the Daggerheart campaign that I was talking about last week. All of these players have played RPGs before, but 3 of them I've played with, and 2 of them I have no idea what their experience level is. And they're a bit more of a wallflower than the other 3 who at least I know what I need to ask in order to get them to open up. But these new players, that was the trickiest bit of it for me, is finding the question that gets them going. It was the most random thing, right? One of the players, all I had to do was start talking about marsh ecology, and the entire character concept coalesced because the player was so interested in what makes a fen different from a bog, from a marsh. And all of a sudden, multiple characters started having a connection to the fens of the Witherwild, which then turned into this sort of, eco world building because the marshes were being drained to turn into like factory farmland for this flower that can create the cure for the plague that is ripping through the land. Sometimes you just got to keep talking, you got to keep talking and keep listening, because no one's got a sign around their neck saying, please talk to me about bog ecology. Would that they would. You just got to do it. You just got to keep moving.
I also think it's important to remember as GMs that it's not that deeply important for a character to have backstory. The more experienced I get playing games, I less and less write detailed character backstories. I usually leave it a couple sessions in before I start getting deeper into the character, whether that's because the game might not take off or because I am not sure how they fit into the world or the sort of dynamic of the other players yet. I tend to just be very broad strokes of like, here's my pitch for a character concept. We'll work with that for a while, which I'm sure can be frustrating for people, but it just lets me remember that it's not like of the deepest importance that a character have a really deep and detailed history.
The one thing that my brother, who introduced me to D&D that many years ago, said was nothing in your character backstory should be more interesting than the adventure you're about to have, because that's why we're going to tell this story. Right? Nobody cares what Luke Skywalker did the day before he met R2-D2 and C-3PO, right? It's not important. He was a farm boy. He was hanging out.
Yeah, like, with Big
it's not interesting.
He wanted power converters.
But the reason that he's not always already a Jedi Knight when that story starts is because that's the story we're going to learn about. So especially, talking about 5th edition and first level in particular, when you're kind of a rung up from a moisture farmer. If you've already single-handedly defeated a demon lord, why are you at first level, And why is the next part of your story going to be important to your character? Somebody, I think James said it earlier as well, though. We were thinking about the players, but I actually think it's a really good character question as well, is what does your character need? Because it gets them thinking about motivation. It gets them thinking about engaging with the adventure. It informs the GM about the sort of adventure they want to go on. I'm kind of, now that I think more about it, and it's a bit of an actor cliche, I'm kind of surprised that I guess you have bonds and ideals and flaws, but there's no direct motivation part of the 5th edition character sheet. I don't know if that's part of like any other role-playing games that folks are familiar with specifically.
Something specifically that has, what do I want? What am I going after? I can't think of any role-playing game that lays it out in such explicit terms, but I'm surprised
Fiasco is the one that comes to mind for me, because I often talk about Fiasco in terms of a great way of establishing character dynamics, but in Fiasco itself, you also determine things that a character wants or needs, or sort of what they're going into a scene trying to achieve, that sort of thing.
Ben, you said something earlier about killing demon lords in your backstory. And in that very same session 0, this is going to be discussion fodder for me for the rest of the month, honestly, is one of my characters has in their backstory that they were part of the fighting force that slew this demigod that kind of kicked off the plot. We were talking about, why are you now a level 1 druid, right? It's been something like 20 years since that happened. Why are you a first level chump again? And the answer was, twofold. One, I'm older now. I have not been, I retired in shame from the Imperial Legion and became a hermit in the woods. And so my skills, my muscles have just atrophied. But also, I laid down the blade and I became a druid instead, right? I changed my way of being. That's a great way, if you want to have, some great feats in your backstory. Introduce some kind of major pivotal moment that caused your entire life to change. And now you've picked up a totally different skill set and left your old life behind.
Yeah, I think video games are very good at if it's a sequel to a video game where you progressed really far in the previous one and then the new game, you have to start from scratch again. So they come up with some narrative reason why your character got kicked in the face and now they've lost all the skills they had previously. You can come up with those sorts of conceits for why your character is back at first level. A grizzled old veteran who saw many battles but now is older and picking up the sword for a second time, for sure. I think particularly when we think about new players, however, the reason I think that that's good advice, that your character hasn't done anything more interesting in their backstory than what's about to happen, is to get them thinking about the adventure they're about to go on and not kind of lost or stuck in some grand idea they have for their backstory. I think for more experienced players, you can kind of get into situations where you can understand how your backstory is meant to relate to the present adventure. But with particularly new players, I've found that when they come up with these epic backstories, it's because they want their character to already be epic from the very beginning of the campaign in a way that stops them from engaging with the adventure as it is and wanting to engage with it as they want it to be. Does that make sense? Walking around and expecting every NPC would know who they are, but they haven't taken the folk hero background. They took something else because they wanted a different feat. You know what I mean?
I think it's a total trap often to get too invested in your backstory unless you know exactly how you want to relate it forward. There's the mimetic trope now of the player with the 16-page backstory who would be better suited to just writing a novel. That's what they really want to do. I think the 16-page backstory is really useful as long as the GM can make something of it, because then you're never at a loss for plot hooks, right? A big backstory can be great as long as it's actionable and as long as the player is invested in connecting it, right? It's a two-way street.
Well, speaking of new players and needs, Wizards of the Coast needs 2 new players, so to speak, because they are hiring for 2 new roles on the design team. Wizards of the Coast put up 2 positions last week or the last couple of days. They're hiring for a principal game designer who leads execution of D&D major product releases. My understanding of the job description was that it was basically they're looking for a design lead on future rulebooks and modules. It sounded like this role would maybe not be too focused on any individual product, but kind of maybe across a couple. And then the other role that they were advertising for, head of game ecosystem, which, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here to try to understand this job description, an authority on continued consistency and accessibility of D&D rules across multiple product releases. And it also calls out across digital and physical products. So I'm assuming that role is more about like, hey, we want to introduce this new system into this new, let's just say super hypothetically, Dragonlance. We want a mass combat system so that people can wage war in their Dragonlance setting. And we're going to put that system in this book. And this role, I'm assuming, would kind of look at any sort of system like that and say, is that accessible? Is that compatible? Is that going to fit into the game? Or is that going to feel like kind of something that's not really going to work with how D&D is intended to be played.
It's hard to parse the businessese sometimes, but
it is, right?
It's interesting to read to more than even, oh, that'd be a cool position, is what are they thinking? And I read that head of game ecosystem more, definitely partly what you say, but also partly like, how are we going to port this over when we make this board game in cooperation with this other company, and we want it to work like we did with Aberration, right? We wanted the board game to be its own thing, but we also wanted to reflect the rules that we have for Grim Hollow. So yeah, I see it as sort of making the game work across several products, but maybe even across several different products.
I'm so sorry. Dael just distracting me in the Discord. I was like, is there some technical error going on? And it's just a t-shirt that says, talk to me about bogs.
That's... Yep.
It was very important that it be designed.
Is that what you were doing? I saw you like looking off camera this whole time. And I was like, oh, Dael's reading something really intently. I mean, the chat's not firing off that much. I guess there's things to read.
I was designing a bug shirt.
Obviously, and also...
I'm going to go buy it now. I don't know what else to say.
Obviously, game ecosystem also means making t-shirts at the drop of a hat. And I think Dael should apply.
Yeah.
And a bog is an ecosystem, you know, the consistency of the bog.
Well, one thing I've noted, and Teos and I discussed this earlier, is that in the latest video for the Scion that Wizards put up on YouTube, they talk with Wes Snyder, who is obviously a big name at Wizards now. And the title that they gave him in the video was, wait for it, Principal Game Designer.
Okay.
So, and this video was released 10 days ago, maybe.
Yeah.
So we're wondering if this is just like, oh, we need to put this out because legal reasons. We need to put up these positions.
Right.
But maybe Principal Game Designer, unless Wes is changing his title, or I don't know what principal means, then that position may already be taken. And
this is the real trick, isn't it? Is that none of these words mean anything. Yeah. They imply things. Yeah. But, you know, are you an executive game designer? Are you a senior game designer? Are you a principal? All of these are interchangeable and are words that are not meant to reflect on you. They're meant to reflect from the company upwards to the people in the C-suite or people in the investment side of things. Wizards has this tendency these days to hire out of the video game world, right? I think it was just last week we were talking about people coming from Xbox over to Wizards of the Coast, and they have been for 5-10 years now. Let me tell you this about video games: never has there been a more title obsessed culture than video game like upper management or middle management studios. It's just it's part of the gene pool right now.
And several positions I've heard of recently where they advertise for them ended up being filled by people already at the company. I've heard that on more than one occasion within the last 2-3 years, and actually going back about 20 years. It's not uncommon. I'm not saying don't apply, but this is why it's hilarious to me that when Chris and Jeremy stepped down, there were all the videos about, oh, WotC's gutted its game design department. Because in the notes here, you have named several people who could fill those positions easily. So you mentioned Wes, you mentioned James Wyatt, you mentioned Mackenzie DeArmas, you mentioned Justice, who all are fine, smart, intelligent, capable folks. You don't mention Jason Tondro, who is a senior game designer there who worked at Paizo and WotC for 10 years. Amanda Hammond, who has worked at Cobalt Press, Paizo, and WotC for over 10 years. Ron Lundeen is a game designer at Wizards and Paizo for the last 8 years. Not just an incredible rules lawyer, but an actual lawyer. Ben Petrosor, who has been at Wizards for 12 years as a game designer and a producer. Patrick Rennie, who has been at Wizards and Paizo for 6 years. I can't imagine them looking for someone to step in and lead these people who have been there for so long, doing the exact things that most of them doing at some point in their career, the things that these positions seem to imply that you need to do. I mean, it's great. And as James said, these words and these titles are all interchangeable, and they end up becoming a big mishmash of just do what you need to do to get the job done in the 12 hours that we have before the deadline is here. Does that sound familiar, Ben?
Yes. Currently, yeah. For the record, I knew that that list of names that I threw on there were not going to be a complete list of the current design team at Wizards of the Coast, partly because, and some of the folks that you mentioned, Shawn, have been on camera, but a lot of the folks that people are more publicly familiar with, like Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins in their time, who one article I was reading referred to them as arguably the face of D&D, at least from the company's perspective. And so, the ponderance is, are they going to put people into that visible position of being like the public spokespeople for the designers from within the team? And then these other roles, because as you were talking, if Wes is already principal game designer, perhaps principal game designer, and again, it's a little vague from their job description, perhaps that is more of like individual project lead as opposed to like overseeing multiple projects. Right. And so there are however many principal game designers working on books in their sequential release order with whoever above them kind of keeping an eye on everything. Does that make sense?
I could be an unprincipled game designer if that helps.
Chris Perkins's last job title before he left, I think, was story architect, or maybe that was second to last. And that's one of those titles where it tells you what it is, but it gives me no information about where he is in the hierarchy other than near the top.
Sure.
Right? It requires a lot of kind of specific knowledge about what the D&D studio looks like. And I think anyone even vaguely close to the studio knows that over the past 5 years, there's been a number of internal restructurings there. So the chain of command, who reports to who within the Wizard studio, it looks basically nothing like what it looks like 5 years ago, more so than ever now that Chris and Jeremy are out of the picture. My hunch is that these hirings are like trying to reestablish a new paradigm.
Speaking of corporate paradigms, I had to untangle this a little bit because I was never really fully across who owned and or published Vampire the Masquerade. So go with me on this journey a little bit. Paradox Interactive, which is more so known as a video game company, but nevertheless, Paradox Interactive has announced that it is rebranding its World of Darkness team, who are kind of set the direction for World of Darkness games such as Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Referening, Changeling the I Came From Somewhere, Mysterious,
Hunter
all their
the Human
famous
Name.
games.
Yeah.
Hunter the I Love to Hunt, Hunter the Cravening. White Wolf, which was the original publishing company to publish Vampire Masquerade going back to, I believe, like the 80s. They were purchased by Paradox back in 2015, I believe it was, if I've got my timeline correct. And then they were dissolved within the company due to some controversies that occurred where a White Wolf publication for the 5th edition of Vampire Masquerade made references to real-world travesties, specifically some violence against the LGBTQI community in Chechnya, and that is putting it very lightly. Then the White Wolf got dissolved, and publishing for Vampire Masquerade first went to Modiphius, then it moved to Renegade Games Studios. So that's part of the confusion, is it's bounced around a few times. And now Paradox Interactive, the company that owns White Wolf and the Vampire Masquerade trademark, want to reestablish White Wolf to bring production of Vampire Masquerade back in-house as opposed to licensing it out to Renegade Game Studios. Are you with me?
We're here.
All right, sure. Cool.
We're barely hanging on by the tips of our fingers.
I mean, that's basically the news. Jason Carl, who is the brand marketing manager for the World of Darkness group, now again the rebranded White Wolf. Folks will know Jason Carl from being the storyteller or the game master from LA by Night, which was the live play Vampire Masquerade. So he's kind of the Chris Perkins of Vampire Masquerade, I think some could argue, just in terms of being like the face of the brand. He did quite an in-depth interview with Christian Hoffer over on EN World, kind of detailing their plans for White Wolf going forward as the company is reestablished, with ambitions to develop Mage the Ascension and Changeling the Dreaming, which are two legacy games that they want to update and do a new edition of, as well as looking at doing a Dark Ages version of their World of Darkness games. World of Darkness, for folks who've never played Vampire Masquerade, typically it's set in the modern world, in modern times. It's very Interview with the Vampire inspired, where vampires kind of hide in a hidden society. Dark Ages basically takes the Vampire Masquerade kind of world and then ports it back into a medieval Dark Ages style setting if you would prefer to play Dark Ages style. So is anybody here like a particular fan of World of Darkness? I've played Vampire a couple of times. I like it. It's not my favorite vampire game, but
I have enjoyed the system. I'm on record saying one of my favorite games I've played in for public consumption is a World of Darkness game that was run by a friend of the podcast, Adam Carnevale, where it was the 80s and we were drug runners. We got attacked by crabs. It was a great time. So I have a lot of affection for the system, yes.
I've never played Vampire, but I hear a lot of stories of World of Darkness LARP from my friend of the podcast, Brooks Donahue. It's a very emotive system, right? It really wants you to get into the role play. It's got that, it's the revolution of the 90s, right? That brought role playing away from dungeon crawling in the first place. So it's got that historical quality to it. And it sounds like people really get into it. But I can't say for certain if that's, on the system or just on the culture.
I've played a bit of Vampire a couple of years ago now, the 5th edition version of it, the most recent version of it. My copy is a Modifius copy I don't know if that makes it worth $1 million on eBay or not, but they're virtually the same as the ones that Renegade have been producing in the years since. But it's a fun system. My issue with it is that it's not, and I think we've talked about this on the Lorecast before, but like for me, the core fantasy of being a vampire, part of it is being able to like rip things apart with your bare hands. And the combat system, for what it is in Vampire Masquerade, that's not what the game wants. The game is more about political intrigue and emotional intrigue and grappling with your humanity, which I think are all really great things, but it feels like it's missing a little something for me. So maybe the Dark Ages version might offer that.
I mean, I know that my brother, for one, has played in Vampire the Masquerade games where they were specifically setting it in the Middle Ages. So I know that there is like demand for that as a thing, as a frame.
Interestingly, as I was looking into this the other week, much like D&D, you have people who prefer their 3rd edition or 3.5 and still play that to this day. People who go back and play like advanced D&D and whatnot at conventions, to see what the game was like back in those days. Vampire has this kind of splintered legacy as well, it feels like, where a lot of people have preferences for, I believe it's called V20, was like the version of the game that was released right before the current 5th edition of the game. I'm assuming it's played on a 20-sided dice instead of the D10 kind of success and failure system. I didn't look that far into it, but people have their favorites, and there are different versions. Like I made a joke before about Vampire Masquerade, Werewolf, the Full Moon, Hunter, the Craven, they're all kind of phrased in that way of like monster, the verb. But even that, I believe, has splintered, where there is like Vampire the Hungering or something that is a different game to Vampire the Masquerade, but kind of has its roots, in the same place. So everybody's kind of got their own favorite version. The Pathfinders of Vampire Masquerade, if you will. Anyway, I look forward to getting yelled at in the comments. Moving on. If you want something to yell at, what about D&D going digital? That is a clickbait way I would describe this next topic. Battlemarked, Daemio and Dungeons and Dragons is a new video game that is apparently coming out in late 2025. I feel like we've talked about Daemio before on this Lorecast. Daemio, if you don't know, it started as a VR game, but now is playable outside of VR. It is basically like a digital board game dungeon crawler type thing. It looks very Gloomhaven-y, Descent, Journeys in the Dark kind of vibe to it, where you have a little miniature character and you basically play a board game, and it's up to 4-player multiplayer. And it's basically digital D&D with a specific story that it is telling you where you don't need a dungeon master. And they have joined with Wizards of the Coast to license a D&D branded Daemio called Battlemarked, which is coming out in late 2025. Can I get a woo? I'm excited.
Woo, I'm excited.
It does look pretty cool. The only thing that surprises me is that its art style does not really resemble D&D very much. It's got its own distinctive thing, both in the in-game graphics and in the key art. So if it weren't for their cards having names like Lay on Hands and stuff like that, and the map having Neverwinter on it, I'd be like,
Sure.
this is any fantasy.
Yeah, my impression from looking at the previews and stuff as well is that it's not adapting the 5th edition rule system. It's using Daimyo's like board game-esque rule system, maybe renaming a couple of things to D&D concepts instead of whatever Daimyo called them before, and coming up with like what would lay on hands look like in Daimyo's game system. So my understanding is it's their game, their system, but it is branded Forgotten Realms. And one of the designers also described the original Daimyo was kind of like a roguelike where you would go on runs, whether it's the battle-marked Daimyo and D&D is more like an adventure where it's like an unfolding story that you go on together and is intended for kind of couch co-op, everybody together style thing.
A head of game ecosystem could figure that out.
Yeah.
We laugh, but I think you're right.
This is kind of what I thought and think Sigil could and maybe was aiming to be in a way.
Intriguing.
Imagine, because Daimyo does not need a dungeon master. At the same time, playing Daimyo is probably more akin to playing something like Gloomhaven or Descent than it is to playing D&D, for the pure reason that it is about the game that you're playing. Like, role-playing is de-emphasized. It's about the game that you're playing on the it's about dungeon delving, and going back to town and selling your supplies, but there's no like negotiation checks necessarily. I don't know that for a fact. This is kind of some assumption here. But can you imagine Daimyo like Curse of Strahd? Like, would that be something that would interest you if it was like the Curse of Strahd story, but told through this large branching? I guess maybe what I'm asking is, would you play Baldur's Gate Curse of Strahd as well?
I play Baldur's Gate Curse of Strahd.
Oh, yeah.
The question is Daimyo Curse of Strahd the same as Baldur's Gate Curse of Strahd, or are they fundamentally different?
Different, I would, let's say different.
Yeah. Well, I'd still probably play both, right? There was that great Strahd, whatever, Ravenloft, Castle Ravenloft board game in the 4th edition era. And that was fun. Initially bought it only for the minis, because the minis were really cool, and I cannibalized them into my D&D games. But I wound up playing the board game, and it was a lot of fun, right? I think there are plenty of people out there who are basically hacking an entirely different game into Curse of Strahd, because Curse of Strahd is largely written for dungeon delving. Like, say what you want. That book is chock-a-block with dungeons. Castle Ravenloft is an enormous dungeon, and even if it was a revolutionarily role-play forward dungeon in the 80s, it isn't really in the 2010s when it came out. It certainly isn't now. So you could adapt Curse of Strahd, I think, pretty faithfully to the way it's written in the book to something like Daimyo. All the stuff that we're doing above the table roleplay-wise is kind of ad hoc on top of what Wizards has presented, except for maybe like the Taroko reading and a couple of sort of cutscene moments like that.
Taraka, not tarot, just for the record.
It doesn't sound like tarot. I choose not to believe this.
That being the case, folks can look forward to battle-marked Daimyo and Dungeons and Dragons, or I think it's actually technically Daimyo and Dungeons and Dragons, battle-marked, if you want the full title, late 2025. Yeah,
it's very search engine optimized. I'll give them that.
That's true. Look, I don't think I would assume anything called battle-marked had anything to do with D&D unless they explicitly told me. So thank you for being explicit. Anyway, speaking of explicit, this is just a quick little bit of news. UK Game Expo happened on May 30th to June 1st. Has become the world's largest tabletop games convention as of the current time of recording, with 42,000 unique attendees, or over 42,000 unique attendees, which was up 7% on last year. PAX Unplugged, who don't publish their attendance, but they're assumed to be averaging about 30K attendance for each PAX Unplugged. These numbers coming, FYI, from EN World. And Gen Con last year was 71K unique attendees. Big props to UK Games Expo for doing that. They're predominantly a board game expo, but role-playing is becoming stronger there as the years go by. We were there this year with a little booth. People went over. I don't know, maybe this is a hyperbolic question, but do we feel like this could in any way kind of suggest a bit of a market shift with the way that the world is at the moment and people being more interested in games in the European territory? I mean, Europe is a massive gaming territory, probably bigger than the US collectively.
Well, the UK isn't really part of Europe now, is it?
Touche. All right.
I didn't make
Too
that
soon.
decision.
Anyway, well done, UK Games Expo. Let's move on before we upset anybody else. 2 Australians and 2 Americans on this podcast. We don't really know much about Europe.
Let me just add that Ghostfire will be at Origins coming up in a week and a half. So if you are at Origins, come to the dealer hall, stop by and wave to the folks from Ghostfire who are there, including Joe Rosso and myself.
Are we running games?
Well, no, we are running like short encounters at the booth, but we're not running full.
Okay,
games.
cool. Go visit the booth.
Yeah.
Wait, that sounds
great.
fun. Booth
We'll have
encounters?
pre-gen characters made
that
with our
sounds
new
fun. Booth
2024 rules from Grim Hollow Transform, so you can check out the character sheet
Nice.
and run a quick little battle there and see how all the rules work. And yeah, it should be fun.
Speaking of 2 Australians and 2 Americans on this podcast, you could say we are in perfect balance between the two nations.
You could say that.
I wouldn't, but you could.
But then again, Dante is the editor, and as the 5th member of the team kind of slants that balance a little bit, which begs the question, which has been asked by Joshua, who emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, how balanced should a tabletop role-playing
That's
game
how we're getting to this
be?
question.
Yes. Playtests often talk about balancing the rule set, but how balanced does a TTRPG need to be? Do rules with more meticulous balance lead to less flexible scenarios and interesting opportunities for improv? Is a lack of balance in a tabletop RPG innately more fun, both for scenarios and character building?
The only balance that matters is between the player characters, right? That's the only thing that matters. If the individual player options are not creating any woefully out of step characters with one another, in D&D especially, where combat is such a main focus, everyone has got to be very combat oriented. If you looked at the Artelsaurian Witcher RPG, right, there are like the Bard class has nothing combat wise, but that shifts the balance towards sort of a more systems level thing, where as long as the Witcher gets their combat moment and the Bard gets their, their persuasion, their social encounter moment, then balance is maintained. When we talk about balance, I think what most people are talking about is monster balance, right? The CR system. People love to complain about the CR system. CR is terrible. CR is perfect. They fixed CR in Monster Manual 2024. I've seen that YouTube thumbnail 8 times already. And at the end of the day, I think that's the least important part of D&D balance, because the GM, like it or not, has the power of the GM screen on their side, which means that all of the balance in the world between the GM and the players is at least a little bit smoke and mirrors. The balance that really comes into play is when players are trying to do the same thing and one person is just wiping the floor with everyone else, right? They're all trying to have the same fun, and someone has taken, 5 slices of cake when everyone only gets to have one.
In terms of monster balance, I think where it's important is just so that the GM, because it doesn't matter, the GM could be like, a red dragon shows up and like breathes fire on all of you and you all die, like balance is a kind of a strange concept from that perspective of like, should encounters be balanced or whatever. But just having the game balanced in a way that GMs have measuring tools. I got to a point where I was DMing where I was very Salt Bae with my encounters. I could just kind of hand measure it and be like, yeah, I think this will challenge them. And every now and again, it would either be a slaughter one way or the other. And most of the time it was kind of okay. But as a early GM coming into a system, being able to numerically kind of know whether you're putting pressure on the party or not, whether you want to or not. It's not about making every encounter balance between the party and the monsters, but just having the tools to know if that's what you're doing between encounters.
See, that's I think a really key element, because we use the word balance, and I think it tricks people into thinking that we're talking about something scientific.
Sure,
but we're not. We're talking about it's balance in the sense of like the balance of a sword, or the balance of one of those little bird toys that goes on your finger, or the balance of the good and evil sides of the force. Like, it's something that you feel. and you're just kind of in the moment adjusting. It's not scientific. It's very vibe based. It's very vague and evocative. It's really about having the ability to kind of sense what's going on around the table, who's feeling, high or low, who's feeling bored, who's feeling not bored, it's really a thing of moving pieces and spinning plates more than it is about numbers and getting the algorithm exactly correct and playing out that equation. So it's something that I think you really only learn with practice. I think it is important to a game. And I think when you're designing a game, it's important to consider the tools that someone has available to adjust that sense of balance. And I think that there are other ways we use that word as well when we're talking about the balance between narrative heavy, open-ended stuff or crunchy mechanical stuff. But I think it is just a much looser term than the name implies.
Yeah, everybody's spot on. And even Joshua knows the answer by asking, is the lack of balance in a TTRPG innately more fun? Yes, it is innately more fun because we could sit down and make a perfectly balanced game right now where every character has the exact same chance of doing a thing and the exact same consequences for doing the thing or failing. And we could put it out there and say, this is a perfectly balanced game, and people would not want to play it because they are just like everybody else. And where balance comes in is really, in terms of the players, is there one option of all the choices you have that is so good that you would never even consider taking any other option? And that is the kind of balance that you want to make so that the choices the characters or the players are making are meaningful in a mechanical way as well as a narrative way.
This had me thinking recently about what I'm calling a closed game system versus an open game system. And I'm wondering if this is a recognized difference in game design. What I mean is, like, balance is obviously much more important in something like a war game where you are competitive.
Any competitive game.
And so you want a sense of balance. But the other thing about a war game, generally speaking, is that it is what I'm describing as, and maybe I'm using the wrong vocabulary or just inventing it, a closed system where, unlike D&D, which actively encourages you, and a lot of role-playing games, which actively encourage you to invent actions, invent things, say, oh, I'm going to do this, and the GM can either figure out whether that fits to a specific rule or not, or just say, okay, let's roll this sort of check and see if that happens. Whereas like a war game is very like, your dudes are on the battlefield, what they can do is defined on their stat sheet. They cannot do anything outside of that or break the rules of the game in any way. And the extreme of this is like a video game that cannot be programmed outside of, like, it's not even open for interpretation because the video game's incapable of it. And the other end of the scale is like, I don't know, we talked about Fiasco before, where it's just like, I'm just saying things and we either decide whether it happens or it doesn't. And then in between, you have a system, and where this maybe becomes more relevant to the discussion we're having, between something like a Pathfinder, by reputation, sorry, I've invoked the name, please don't get mad at me, and a 5th edition, where there are many more rules for Pathfinder for describing lots of different situations that 5th edition D&D might just be like, I don't know, make a check and we'll decide if it happens or not, as opposed to going through multiple different steps to be able to resolve a situation. Is balance more important in a game that is crunchier, that is kind of a more closed system or tries to be a more closed system? Is that even an intelligible question? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between a closed system and a large system. A large system, You need to keep an eye on balance more simply because it is a large system. And there are more things that may get out of balance. Rock, paper, scissors is a closed system, but it's a simple system. Yeah, there's a differentiation along two different axes there that you're talking about.
We should do a rock, paper, scissors tier list.
This doesn't answer what you were saying, but something you said made me think it as well.
Sure.
Which is just that I think the tricky thing with balance is that it's always easier. I think in any version of balance or any game, it is always easier to tell if something isn't balanced than if something is. You could be playing Marvel Snap, you could be playing Warhammer, you could be playing whatever, Draw Steel, and you sort of go, I know that this thing feels wrong. This feels too overpowered. That's taking too many slices of the cake. But I'm not sure why, or I'm not sure what I can do to combat that, or I'm not sure if there are other things like checks and balances, keeping it sort of in place that just aren't triggering in this situation where maybe they should be. So that's kind of a really difficult thing when you are handling balance or try to keep an eye on balance in your game, is that you kind of only trip over those landmines when you get to them. But I don't know. I don't have like any advice after that observation.
So I guess the answer is, to be concise, between players and for the use of the GM to understand how they're structuring encounters, yes. Is it meticulously important? No.
Yeah.
We solved it. All right,
yeah.
cool.
Balance is good, but it's also kind of a ghost.
Yeah. Speaking of ghosts, could your BBEG be one? That is a sort of question that Matt has asked about unintelligent, big, bad, evil villains. We talked a little bit about this on the Lorecast a couple of weeks ago. There was a question about having humanoids as the kind of main villains and main quarries, if you will, of your campaign, where D&D is a game about fighting monsters, and the monster manual, by large, is filled with different monsters. But if you prefer your games to thematically grapple with the evils of humanity, can you create campaigns that are based around humanoid villains who are more intelligent than they are necessarily physically dangerous? That was a quick summary of that past topic. This question is kind of asking the inverse about, is it possible to make an unintelligent, rampaging monster into the long-term villain of your campaign? So we are discluding things like liches or vampires that can scheme and are fundamentally kind of like thematically represent human evils, and talking more about maybe like an aberrant horror. But I think the true spirit of the question is things like a Tarask, a werewolf, a kraken. You know, I don't know, maybe krakens are intelligent. I've never spoken to one. Anyway.
Have you ever watched Cloverfield? It's a horror movie from the 2010s that is basically it's a big monster movie, right? And the big monster is never shown on screen until very, very late into the movie. It's this sort of eldritch horror-y thing. But the best part of the movie is before the monster shows up, because it's about all the simmering tensions that the mere existence of the monster evokes. And that way, it's a lot like Godzilla -1.
I was thinking that exact same thing.
Yeah, right. You know, the villain, the sort of antagonist, the driving force of destruction, has no real point of view, at least not one that we, the audience, the actors in the events are privy to. But, you know, the threat of mass uncontrolled death and destruction is enough to create all sorts of minor antagonists everywhere. And that's what you got to do. I mean, if it's just monster rampaging everywhere, then that's a superhero act 3, right? That is beat up the big monster. There's no character drama in that.
Is it possible to make an unintelligent rampaging monster into a long-term villain? Have you been in the United States for the last few years? As James points out, right, you might not even be able to fight that monster, but it's the little monsters that come from that. It's the thing behind the monster, even though it is unintelligent, doesn't know what it's doing, but it's still vile and can wreak havoc. It's the people that try to use that to gain from, right? Those are the things that you can use as the intelligent monsters until you get to fighting that big monster.
This it all just makes me think of, first of all, I want to know, how long term are we talking? Because if your campaign is like 8 sessions, very doable. I also do think that, particularly with the help of minor villains who arise as a result, you can make a long-term baddie out of a rampaging beast. But I also am just like fascinated by, because I'm on record in my settings, I like things if they're either explicitly magical and intelligent, or they are beastly, right? If it doesn't need to be magical or intelligent, I like it to just be a beast. I'm a big fan of just a beast. And so I'm fascinated by the idea of games. I've wanted to run games where it's like there's just giants, and I'm not talking I'm not talking like D&D giants. I'm talking like titans, like giants Is my
You're back.
internet
Yeah, we didn't hear a word
gone?
of that.
Yeah.
No.
No, you're back. We can hear you.
No, I'm
Go
so
again.
sad. I was building up steam.
top? We're going to do a second take. Dael, are you ready for take
Back to one. All right.
All right, everybody back to one. We are rolling. Check sound. Action.
I've always been fascinated by the idea of running.
Cut. Sorry. There was a sound error. We just need to retake that one. Give me a couple of seconds. Are we good? Sorry, everyone. This never happens. All right, cool. All right, I think we're good. All right, director saying yes, and action.
Hi, I'm Dael Kingsmill, and I've always been fascinated by the idea.
Do you need a moment to collect yourself? Are you okay?
All right, okay, the bit's over. I'm telling you about these giants. So
And scene.
and scene. No, I've always been fascinated by the idea of running a campaign where instead of like D&D sized giants, there's like Titanic giants that
Sure.
just like wander into a city. And they're not there to do anything nefarious. It's just that this is, I don't know, they're migrating. This is where they've landed and the city has to like book it. And now you as the heroes have to like try and get people out, try to not get crushed by all this like falling debris or whatever. And then having to like gather an army to come back and slay the giants, something like that. I'm fascinated by ideas. I always like the idea of like Superman should be confronted with like a natural disaster, like a cyclone or something, right? Because that's something that Superman can't just punch. I love those ideas. I love the idea of high level D&D play where you throw a flood at the players and they have to deal with that. I love the idea of like a spooky little like hamlet in a haunted wood and there's a great animal that is killing people on the roads and making like a proper campaign, like mini campaign out of that. So I don't know, I'm just I don't know, hopeful or wishful, but I love the idea of making just a beastly creature be a major baddie. One of my main campaign points was that the dragons were losing their intelligence. They were getting werebacked, I call it, because in the film, Wereback, a dinosaur story, part of the plot hinges on the dinosaurs who have been made intelligent getting reverted back to being just beasts, and that always freaked me out as a kid. And so I was like, that should happen to the dragons. So I don't know, I love it. I don't just think it's possible, I love it.
Yeah, I love the idea. I want to say I got this idea originally from WebDM, like way back in the day, but they talked about, I think, a Tarrasque encounter for like a level 3 party. But the idea is not that you're like fighting the Tarrasque. It's kind of, think Game of Thrones when Daenerys attacks King's Landing, but Arya's perspective on the ground, kind of running around trying to survive and trying to help other people survive this attack kind of as it happens.
You know what, Ben? If you're interested in that, I'm going to steal Dael's thunder and say, if you're interested in that kind of story, you should watch for The Fall of Blackbottom for Draw Steel, an adventure I'm playtesting right now with its author, Leon Barilaro. Because if you swapped out the forces of Ajax the Iron Saint with a rampaging monster, which I think you could do without much difficulty, you would have exactly what you're describing right here.
I was rereading The Fall of Blackbottom the other day, the original version, and I was thinking, how could you swap this out for like a rampaging beast? So there you go.
There it is.
The other one that I really like, I think this plot is incredibly evocative in its early seasons, and mild spoilers for anybody, I won't go into detail, but I was fascinated by the early plot of Attack on Titan. This idea that humanity lives in a bird cage, the injustice of it, and the utter ignorance of what the Titans are, what they want, can they want, why are we stuck like this, and Eren's whole narrative about the injustice of it all. And I think, the first 2 seasons-ish of that are just so like vague and evocative where you're like, what is going on? What, people are Titans? What is happening here? And then I think by the later seasons, it loses that a little bit as the mystery gets, revealed and unfolded, and it's just like people are the real monsters. I don't know where the plot is going for the record, but I have a very similar feeling with Expedition 33, where it feels very similarly like, what is going on? Why is humanity reduced to these dregs? And I think having villains kind of like the Titans from Attack on Titan, you could make them ghosts, that kind of They never speak. They never say anything. They just kind of come out of the grave and drag people to their doom. In Expedition 33, the plot is that every year, everyone of a certain age just kind of dies and disappears, and nobody understands why that is happening. I think that is for a really evocative mystery, and potentially just like an elemental force in the world could be something that could be a cool villain that's not necessarily conniving or plotting. But yeah, I find that narrative, it's kind of almost nihilistic, like the world itself is uninhabitable.
And it lends itself to those styles of play that are a little bit more offbeat, the sort of investigations, or the you must go and gather a bunch of stuff or fetch quests. I don't know. I can't think of other types of quests now that I've started this sentence. But I still stand by my statement.
Yeah. The other good example is like a zombie apocalypse, like 28 Weeks Later or The Walking Dead or something like that, or The Last of Us, where again, it's kind of a narrative where like humans are the real monsters, and you can play into that if you want to. You don't have to. But this circumstance creates a situation where, lots of little problems arise as a result. Anyway, I feel like we're just giving examples of earlier things that people said. So with that, I'm going to give you listening an example of how we end this show, which is usually badly. But if you want to ask a question, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, and I will ask the fine folks here, and we will answer it, and hopefully it will be satisfying for you and everybody else listening. I've been Ben Byrne. I'm here with James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin. If you like the episode, you can give it a thumbs up, a star, stuff, things, good vibes. We'll see you next week. We're here. Twitch.
Good vibes.
7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific on a Monday. It's Tuesday, 9 a.m. Australian Standard Time. Okay, goodbye.
Imagine if that was the whole end. Okay, goodbye.
And that's the end. Goodbye. And farewell. Goodbye. We'll see you all again. But we're still online.
You have
I think.
never learned the lyrics.
No.
Come on, people.